Hi, folks. Today we're talking about chapters 11 and 12, social movements and policy. So, generally, we're talking about with social movements, mass efforts for social change meant to occur locally, regionally, or nationally. And we, within that, have a few considerations to make. First, what is it that the movement or movements embedded within the larger movement, what is it that they want to change or accomplish? Second, how much, what level or degree of change is desired? Within that, we've got a few different types. The first kind that we can denote or talk about are alternative social movements. So, with alternative social movements, the intention is to change individual beliefs and behaviors around norms, particularly around self improvement, such as substance abuse, as well as reproductive rights. And so, these are small scale, kind of micro sociological in nature. Now, they contrast to redemptive social movements, another type, where the goals are to promote some kind of interior or inner change or spiritual growth in a way that's consistent with religious salvation. So these are meaning seeking kinds of movements that are mid range or medium scale, so sort of meso sociological. So they form a bridge between the individual and the wider society that surrounds them. With Reformation or reformative social movements, these target the entire population. These are large scale macro social changes, macro social movements that seek to permanently change key aspects of social structure and society itself. So often these social movements are consistent with, in some way, resolving the status position of those groups that have historically been marginalized in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, class, as well as environmental justice. And then we also have revolutionary social movements. These are, again, large scale macro social movements that seek to change society in a large, dramatic fashion, such as, say, for instance, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. Within social movements, we have unique stages. The first being preliminary, where there's awareness of an issue, the awareness of the issue develops, and then the leaders within that process emerge. From that stage, you can also see a migration to coalescence, where groups will band together to publicize an issue and get organized. And then you also can see, with continued growth, institutionalization. So that's the third stage, where the group becomes an established organization with a paid staff and much larger formal social networks. Now, we can also separate or distinguish social movements in a few ways. So, in a way, there's a social movement continuum. We can distinguish them by scope. So, in terms of scope, what kind of change is sought? Is it a relatively minor reformation or some kind of small scale reform, or is it rather a larger, more radical change? You can also distinguish social movements by type, whether or not they are relatively small scale and conservative, or are they innovative? Are they more daring in some sort of way, or in a sense kind of brand new? You can also distinguish social movements by target. Are they focused on individuals, or are they focused on larger social groups? You can rather distinguish social movements by method. So are they going the route of violence, or are they going the route of civil disobedience? And you can also distinguish social movements in terms of their range. Are these more, again, with range, local movements with a local focus and basis, or are they global movements? And so we have examples here that we can discuss that involve a set of different, if you will, issues of scope, type, target, method, and range. For instance, Black Lives Matter, co-founded in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Black Lives Matter grew out of George Zimmerman's acquittal in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin in 2012. With respect to the Standing Rock Sioux, with this social movement starting in 2016, the Youth Council, per training from the Indigenous Action Network, began a months-long relay run and peaceful protest starting from disputed land on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in an effort to resist the extension of the Dakota Access Pipeline through the northern portion of the reservation. And also, not to be left out, white nationalist movements demonstrated most recently to disturbing effect at the January 6, 2021 Capitol uprisings and the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, with respect to policy, we have to consider the following. We have to consider that the world we live in, the social world in particular, is unequal, and that this is not a positive circumstance by and large. So how do we promote equality in an inequitable world, in a world that's inherently unequal? So we can do that through law, through policy, and through practice. And so we can look at it in a couple of different ways in terms of equality as well as equity. With equality, with that approach, we're providing the exact same resources to all. However, equity differs by meaningfully addressing barriers to equality, by providing targeted, tailored support to each disadvantaged group. It's a guarantee of fairness, access, and opportunity while simultaneously working to eliminate structural barriers. Affirmative action as well as reparations are exemplary of discussions of equity as well as equality itself. Concerning affirmative action, the overall goal with the emergence of affirmative action was to offer redress to and for prior and past discrimination, particularly in terms of employment as well as college enrollment and attendance. So ultimately, protected classes under affirmative action include women as well as people of color. In fact, women are the largest protected class under affirmative action. And so, again, the efforts were made with respect to affirmative action emerging throughout the late 60s and 70s to provide opportunities in support of women and people of color and minorities going into formally, if you will, isolated fields that they did not have the ability to gain entrance into. Proponents of affirmative action state that this is an equity-based approach, that we're looking squarely at the experiences of women, we're looking squarely at the experiences of Latinx folks, African American folks, with respect to equity and access, and that in so doing, in targeting what's happened to those groups in the past, we are doing what we can to provide equity by providing some way of eliminating and some way of erasing past discrimination. Conversely, others have also said that affirmative action is effectively reverse discrimination, that we are using some form of discrimination to ultimately eliminate discrimination. And we've seen the Supreme Court, along with state-level courts, having provided, in a sense, controls to or limits to affirmative action law. And while affirmative action is the federal law of the land, there are some limits to the usage of and the recognition of affirmative action, particularly in workplaces and on college campuses. With respect to reparations, we do have precedent insofar as past reparations within the United States, particularly given to Japanese Americans and the descendants of Japanese Americans who were interned during wartime, with respect to internment camps largely on the West Coast during World War II. So for some, that is a litmus test for the provision of reparations for African Americans. The notion being that we have precedent and there is significant systemic injury that we can note at multiple institutional and social levels experienced by African Americans. So the notion here is that this would yet be another form of providing equity in terms of approaching and producing ultimately equality. Proponents say that this would be not only an equity-based approach, but it would do tremendous good with respect to eliminating wealth inequality as well as health disparities, in particular for African Americans. And we've seen local governments take up the reparations front in certain parts of the country. Nevertheless, as in the case of affirmative action, some feel that this form of redress is anything but, and that it's ultimately another form of discrimination, much for or in the same way that people may dispute the effectiveness of affirmative action.